We are inside the Christopher Kraft Mission Control Center at Johnson Space Center, a building steeped in history.
It was here 50 years ago this week. A room full of brilliant minds put man on the moon.
Half a century later, the world is still in awe of Apollo 11 and Space City.
Tonight, we celebrate both.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. We've got the flag up now, and you can see the stars and stripes on the lunar surface. Columbia, this is Houston, reading you loud and clear, over. Yeah, radio loud and clear, how's it going? Lots of smiling faces in this room and all over the world. And we're getting a picture on the TV.
The first lunar landing, July 20th, 1969. Truly a pivotal moment, not just in space history, but the history of the world.
And how it happened, what led up to it, is all part of the story, starting with a space race that Americans were desperate to win.
Throughout the world, throngs of people hailed the end of the war in Europe. Now the war against Germany is won.
When World War II ended, another major conflict began. The Cold War, a decades-long power struggle between the United States and Russia, two superpowers vying for superiority. But this clash of titans would not play out on a battlefield. This combat was cerebral, each country laser-focused on rocket technology. The Cold War and the rocket rivalry would become the backdrop for the space race. Russia claimed the first victories, with Sputnik and the first human in orbit.
Russia's success.
Potential enemy temporarily ahead.
Then President John F. Kennedy threw down the gauntlet. First, before a joint session of Congress,
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
And then with an electrifying speech at Rice University.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
A vision that took hold on a patch of land off 45 South, NASA's Manned Spacecraft Center. The Mercury and Gemini projects
Gemini 12, Houston, Capcom.
set the stage for Apollo, a program that saw successes and setbacks. Before any Apollo missions flew, the U.S. would experience its first space disaster. 3 astronauts killed in a flash fire during a launch rehearsal test. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, forever remembered as the heroes of Apollo 1.
High top everything.
The missions that followed were building blocks for Apollo 11. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins would make history with the help of 400,000 NASA employees and contractors behind the scenes, sending America across the space race finish line first. That moment in the summer of '69 was celebrated across the country and envied across the globe. But there was one part of the world that experienced it like no other.
Houston's space community, Clear Lake, El Lago, Nassau Bay, Timber Cove, all were called home by astronauts, flight directors, and mission control employees. An area built on oil and then fueled by spaceflight.
Before Houston was Space City, it was a bustling city with an identity of its own. In 1960, oil and shipping were the backbone industries for a population nearing 1 million. But soon, it would grow even more with an infusion of space pioneers. In 1961, NASA chose Houston to be the home of the Manned Spacecraft Center. Construction began on about 1,000 acres on the edge of Clear Lake, land donated by Humble Oil to Rice University. As it was being built, the first astronauts moved to town in the summer of '62. The city held a huge welcome parade in their honor. John Glenn, just months after he became the first American to orbit the Earth, embraced the image of being a space cowboy in Texas.
We were exhorted to look, act, and talk the part. We now look the part. We'll follow your lead in acting the part, and howdy.
The Manned Spacecraft Center was completed in September 1963. Its opening ushered in what would become a stunning era of space exploration. The Gemini missions, the bridge to the moon, testing the skills it would take to get there, and then the main event, Apollo. And Houston was the center of it. Just months, weeks, and days before their launch, the Apollo 11 astronauts training at Ellington Field, at the Manned Spacecraft Center, and even in the Gulf off of Galveston. Rarely seen footage showing astronauts, engineers, scientists, technicians, Houstonians laying the groundwork for a moment that would change the world. But to truly understand Houston's role in that milestone on the moon, we must know, see, and feel what life was like leading up to it.
The story of Space City and how it came to be is really, I think, one of the great stories of Texas history. How a southeast Texas cattle ranch became a virtual trailhead to space.
Born out of a country's celestial crusade, a unique community that had never happened before or since. Entire neighborhoods filled with space workers.
We thought everyone knew an astronaut. They were just regular people.
Astronauts weren't celebrities in our neighborhood. It was a way of life.
That was just normal. We didn't know any different.
Home after home after home that looked like any other in Middle America, except these belonged to the greatest minds of their generation.
We just happened to be over there on the other side of the street, working on the space program, that's all.
We all went to the same bus stop. We went to school together. We were always out in the yard playing, and it wasn't really different.
They were just kids being kids, while their fathers were changing the world.
It wasn't unusual for me to have 2 or 3 other kids in my class whose dads were astronauts or flight directors or engineers, and we all knew when somebody's dad was flying.
It was a rare utopia that was not lost on the wives.
I want to know what it felt like. Everybody lived together and worked together. So what was that like?
I thought it was wonderful. We all lived around each other, so we were always together.
Behind my house, Buzz and Joan Aldrin lived, and we had a gate that we opened. So we'd oftentimes, the guys were gone a lot, and so we'd have coffee together or maybe afternoon tea.
A quiet life for the wives, as their husbands lived out loud, but the women did occasionally find themselves in the spotlight.
Where are the microphones?
Right here's the camera.
Barbara Cernan speaking to reporters in this footage found in our KPRC archives. Her astronaut husband, Gene Cernan, had just completed Apollo 10.
And I can see the whole moon from top to bottom in my forward window.
A dress rehearsal for the Apollo 11 moon landing.
This is certainly one of the most exciting days of my life, and I'm sure that Gene and Tom and John feel the same way.
Even a 6-year-old Tracy got some camera time.
No.
I do look at the moon totally different. And as I'm older, I really look at it. It's very special to me, and appreciate the fact that Daddy was there. And he always explained how beautiful it is, and how he always felt like he was sitting on God's front porch looking back at the earth.
We're very grateful to those large effort of people here at MSC and across the nation who made those first flights possible, successful, and made it possible for us to sit here today and discuss Apollo 11 with you.
To launch the United States to the front of the space race and onto the moon's surface, NASA's best and brightest had to work and plan and train constantly.
The pressure on the guys to do stuff was enormous. And my own experience, we were gone all the time. all the time. I leave on Sunday night, come back on Friday night.
Which meant sometimes the wives had to be mothers and fathers.
They served as den mothers in Cub Scouts and troop leaders for Girl Scouts.
I've heard Barbara Cernan say, you think going to the moon was hard, you should have tried staying home.
You learn to do everything. You learn to mow the grass, you learn to pay the bills, keep the house together, do everything. And it wasn't that it was so difficult, it was just, it became part of your life.
I didn't resent it at all because I was doing my part. I felt like I was doing what I was supposed to do to make everything work.
Looking back at all that film and all the accolades that the guys got, I just thought to myself, I can't believe I was really a part of that.
So now that you know how they lived, where were they as NASA reached that culminating achievement, putting man on the moon?
I was in my living room with other people, and it was, you were so proud as an American to know that we had actually accomplished what we'd set out to do.
When they picked him up at the ship, that's when we had the champagne.
And I do recall, y'all made us get out of the pool to come watch landing on the moon, and then we're like, okay, can we go back in? Yeah, exactly. Can we go back swimming?
Still ahead, a visit to an old Apollo neighborhood yields a surprising find.
It says Neil and Jan Armstrong, 1968.
Never before seen footage of the man who would become the first to walk on the moon.
But first, the heroes of Mission Control.
We're very proud of the work we did, and as a team, we hung tough.
How a room full of space prodigies made history, one harrowing step at a time.
As we celebrate Houston's mission to the moon, we are also paying tribute to the astronauts who carried out that historic lunar landing. Neil Armstrong, commander of Apollo 11 and the first human to step foot on the moon, loved flying so much he got his pilot's license before he got his driver's license. A naval aviator, a Korean War veteran, a test pilot, an astronaut, and after NASA, a university professor. But of course, this is what the world will remember most.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
On the surface of the moon, I could look up and see the planet Earth. And it was very bright and very beautiful.
Armstrong died in 2012. He was 82 years old.
As part of this 50th anniversary, Apollo Mission Control has undergone a major transformation, fully restored back to the era that changed everything.
It was here in this room at those consoles where dozens of people worked around the clock to put man on the moon.
50 years later, several of them sat down with our Rosa and Aragon to talk about their role in space history.
Go!
Capcom, we're go for landing.
Roger, understand. Go for landing. 3,000 feet.
You knew that decisions were made in this place. You had a sense of history.
Verify that both S-band breakers are in, over.
It was a workplace, a home, a sanctuary, where a team of doers made the impossible happen.
Capcom, we're stay for T1.
Where farm boys, fresh grads, and some who claimed they were just plain lucky made history here in Houston and out of this world.
Engine arm off.
We copy you down, Eagle.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
This is Mission Control.
I look at it as a leadership laboratory where we take young people in there. Green as grass, fresh out of college. And we turn men and women into controllers. Okay, all flight controllers, go for landing. Retro. Go. Rhino. Go. Guidance. Go. Control. Go.
The young men in skinny ties and pocket protectors with just a few years under their belts found themselves facing the presidential challenge of the decade.
Landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
At the helm of that landing was none other than Flight Director Gene Kranz, a former aerospace engineer and fighter pilot.
My final words to my controllers were, I will stand behind every decision you will make. We came into this room as a team and we will leave as a team. And then one of my controllers went and locked the control room doors, and we would not leave that room, and the doors would not be open until we'd either landed, we'd crashed, or we aborted. And only one of those cases was good. We had to land.
Following in the footsteps of former flight director Chris Kraft, Kranz's renowned mantra of tough and competent became the team's working creed.
How's our margin looking, Bob?
Failure was not an option.
The managers gave us that responsibility. They trusted us. And when somebody trusts you that much, you're damn sure not going to let them down.
Jerry Bostick, a flight dynamics or FIDO controller from rural Mississippi, sat in what was known as the trench, the very frontier, seating the guys who walked with a bit of swagger. They knew their job was to guide the spacecraft. In the retro seat right next to him was Chuck Dietrich.
We were all young at the time, and we were smart enough to be scared or think we couldn't do it.
Steely-eyed missile man John Aaron, the son of a farmer and minister, was an ECOM controller, monitoring electrical and environmental life support systems.
We had a lot of early failures. We blew up a lot of stuff. But we always learned something.
A place of discovery, endeared with coffee stains and tar-sooted ceilings.
We smoked cigarettes, pipes, cigars in that room right on down the line. But that was the nature of the beast.
But the Mission Operation Control Room, or MOCR 2, was just one of several that made up the center. In the Support Services, or SSR room, you found then ECOM trainee Mississippi native Bill Moon, the first Asian American to work in mission control.
There was a sense of rivalry amongst the organizations. We were the systems guys. And then you had the trench with the FIDOs and GUIDOs and retros. I mean, they showed us how to get there. They pointed, looked at the stars and all that. I don't understand all that good stuff. But we kept the vehicles running, and kept the crew alive.
That crew was a trio, some of the best and brightest. Commander Neil Armstrong, Lunar Module Pilot Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and Command Module Pilot Michael Collins.
Mike Collins was probably the brightest of the three, well-read, had a hell of a education, everything like that.
Frank Hughes knew them like family. It was his job. As a simulator instructor, he trained the astronauts how to troubleshoot if things went wrong.
Let's face it, they didn't know, we don't know, we all learned together.
On July 16, 1969, Hughes would also find himself in mission control, along with Ed Fendel, a controller tasked to support communications with Michael Collins. Years later, Fendel would be known as Captain Video for his camera work with the lunar rover.
You just went and did things. Your boss said to do it, you found a way to do it.
The right kind of attitude for the right kind of mission. Fendel's colleague Rod Lowe knew they were on the verge of doing something big when he introduced his 6-year-old son to Neil Armstrong.
I asked Craig, I said, do you know who that was? He said, no, he didn't have the idea. And I said, we're going to make him first man on the moon.
And that's exactly what they did.
That's one small step for man.
In this very room. This young team of professionals would begin the mission of a lifetime.
No doubt it's going to work. We're going to make it happen.
Landing man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth.
There's no equivocation. It's go or no go.
Now that you've met the heroes of mission control, it's time to go inside the landing that would change history.
We know the crew has 2 minutes, and very soon one of my controllers is going to start counting down the seconds of fuel remaining.
Nerves of steel in an unnerving situation. Next.
Click2Houston.com is the place to go to explore more stories about the moon landing, like a Webster Church's very important role.
He took a chalice and he took a slice of bread.
The heavenly inspiration for Buzz Aldrin's lunar communion. That story and much more on click2Houston.com/Apollo.
The second man to step foot on the moon was astronaut Buzz Aldrin. Born in New Jersey as Edwin Eugene Aldrin Jr., he got the nickname Buzz from his sister. She couldn't pronounce brother and instead called him Buzzer. His family shortened it to Buzz. He made it legal in 1988. Third in his class at West Point, a fighter pilot in Korea, an MIT education, then a NASA astronaut. Part of the Gemini 12 crew, Aldrin completed an historic 5-hour spacewalk, and then Apollo 11.
Apollo 11 was about exploration, about taking risks for great rewards in science and engineering, about setting an ambitious goal before the world.
Aldrin, now 89, remains a passionate advocate for human space exploration, calling for a return to the moon, and then Mars.
Before the break, Houston space reporter Roseanne Aragon introduced you to some of the major players in mission control.
Now, their story continues as they take us step by step through a mission that changed the world. They were engineers, scientists, technicians from all across the country.
But in this room in July of 1969, they were a team of Houstonians that made history.
It was the week of July 16th, 1969.
I got out of the car and I thought, you know, we have trained so long. And I thought, okay, this is the day we're going to do it.
So let's do it.
Tough and competent.
We became hard, still hard.
Teamwork and diligence.
You've never seen teamwork like you have until you work at NASA.
Duty and determination.
We knew we were going to go all the way.
Commander Neil Armstrong made it clear this was for everyone.
And the last line says, "We came in peace for all mankind." I think that's precisely what we mean.
T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal.
On July 16th, on historic launch pad 39A at Cape Canaveral, the Saturn V catapulted the spacecraft to a maximum velocity of 25,000 miles per hour.
Every second, it meant that those humans were going faster than anyone had ever gone, and that they were leaving the Earth.
Columbia, Houston, we'll have LOS at 101.
Around 100 hours into the flight, after successfully entering lunar orbit, Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin transferred into the snug lunar module.
LM looks to be in pretty fine shape. About all we can see from here.
Command module pilot Michael Collins stayed in Columbia, orbiting the moon, ready to help.
Listen, Dave, everything's going just swimmingly. Beautiful.
Great. We're standing by for Eagle.
Collins' role was critical. He was their lifeline should things go wrong. But with failure not an option, it was time.
The descent was roughly about 12 minutes long, and it was a battle.
Verify that both S-band breakers are in, over.
Communicating with the astronauts was Capcom controller Charlie Duke.
It was really tense in mission control. As the closer we got, the more tense it became.
Painstaking calculations and razor-sharp checkpoints. Mission control hung tough.
Are we going to get the landing radar? Because the crew was descending to the moon with information we provided them from the ground, which could have been several thousand feet in air.
The way they flew, Neil was looking out the window all the time, and Buzz was reading altitude and speed and things like that to him.
The crew was landing long, headed towards a crater. Then
1202 alarm.
You know them so well that you know inherently by the tone on their voice and everything like that what's going on.
Give us a reading on the 1202 program alarm.
An unfamiliar alarm.
The computer was basically running out of time to do all the functions it had to do.
We're going, that alarm?
Laid the burden upon me to say, do we have enough data to continue?
With little time to troubleshoot, Guidance Officer Steve Bales made the call. It was just a nuisance alarm.
Roger, we got you. We're going, that alarm.
But now the crew was running extremely low on fuel.
We're moving towards our abort limit, but we'll watch it pretty close.
Eagle, Houston, you're a go for landing, over.
But then
1201. Roger, 1201 alarm. Same type, we're go, flight. Okay, we're go. We're go, same type, we're go.
Another nuisance, but the relief was short-lived. They had less than a minute before they ran out of fuel.
60 seconds.
Are they going to make it? Are they going to make it?
Picking up from 30 seconds.
In mission control, we have handles on the television in there. You grab that handle and you're holding on for life.
With just seconds to go, Armstrong, a seasoned test pilot, picked a smoother place to land in the Sea of Tranquility.
He knew where he was, and he knew where he was in that process.
4 forward, drift into the right level.
About the time we would have said 15 seconds, we recognized the crew's going through engine shutdown.
Contact light.
The team had done it. for the world.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
And that was the way I felt. The whole room was that way.
People watched from all over the world. Though in mission control, a short-lived moment and back to work. Just upstairs in the viewing room, uncontrollable joy.
The people in the viewing room were what broke the code. They started stamping and cheering and everything else. All of a sudden, this noise filters into the room, and my controllers start to catch it.
Okay, keep the chatter down in this room.
This team on Earth helped put the American flag on the moon.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
At the moment it happened, you had a sense of pride, exhilaration.
This certainly has to be the most historic telephone call ever made from the White House. I just can't tell you how proud we all are of what you have done.
But the mission wasn't over.
Unfortunately, we were so involved in the technical aspects of it that we kind of missed the wow part of it.
After 8 days on July 24th, 1969, the Apollo 11 capsule splashed down in the Pacific Ocean.
Anytime you get the crew back on Earth, that's successful.
And only then did this team truly realize the gravity of what man had done.
Walked down the car and cried. It dawned on me what we had done.
It lifted the whole country.
And 50 years later,
In the mornings when I'd go out and to get the paper, I would look up and see the moon and say, by God, we were there. And so yeah, I looked at it differently.
This is a very precious time for, I think, everyone in the room, because we'd like to do it over again, only join the rest of the world celebrating the landing.
Still ahead, making the lunar landing the ultimate viewer experience.
We had one that just, a button that was just labeled moon.
How KPRC made it possible for the world to see the first steps on the moon.
And next, a step back in time. What this mystery canister reveals about Neil Armstrong.
As Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin took mankind's first steps on the moon, a third crew member orbited miles above them, Michael Collins, the Apollo 11 command module pilot. Collins was born in Rome, where his father, a career Army officer, was stationed. Collins followed in his father's footsteps to West Point and then the Armed Services. But instead of the Army, his love of flying led him to the Air Force. As an astronaut, he flew to space twice, Gemini 10 and Apollo 11.
I wish I could have walked on the moon. Undeniably, I felt that way at the time. Still, I'm sorry I missed that. But I can say with the utmost honesty, I was thrilled to have the place that I had.
Each astronaut, Collins, Aldrin, Armstrong, all leaving their own footprint on history.
Just like all other Apollo astronauts, Armstrong lived in Houston's space community. The home in El Lago still sits there to this day.
When Armstrong wasn't prepping for the mission of a lifetime, he was spending time with his family and his neighbors. And tonight, one of those neighbors is sharing never-before-seen footage with us. Corrine Poole knew the Armstrongs before NASA was even NASA. They first crossed paths at Purdue University in Indiana.
We met in college. I was initiated into Alpha Chi Omega sorority, and Jan was 2 years ahead of me, and that's where I met both of them.
After college, it would be the Apollo program that would bring them back together. Corrine's husband, Jerry, a Boeing employee, was relocated to Houston's space community in 1967.
When we moved from Seattle down here to Texas, the realtor that was showing us homes came into El Lago with us, and they said, by the way, Jan and Neil Armstrong live here. And I said, oh, really? We were sorority sisters.
All those years later, they reconnected.
We went to their house right down the street here and had dinner with them in the evening and renewed a friendship. And then Jan talked us into buying this house.
The Pooles were sold on the house and on living the space life.
I eventually went to work at NASA, too, in the clinic. I'm a lab technician, and I did all the blood work and stuff on the astronauts.
The sorority sisters and their husbands became more than neighbors. They were in each other's lives.
We ate at their house, played in the pool. They came here for dinner sometimes, and that was just, the friendship.
A friendship that lives on, not just in her memories. When we first set out to tell this story, we canvassed El Lago to find people who had connections to the Armstrong family. Well, Corinne had connections, and then some. Imagine our surprise when she showed us this 8mm film canister.
It says Neil and Jan Armstrong, 1968.
Where has this been for the last 50 years?
It has been in a metal box with other film casing, canisters, whatever you call these, on a shelf in our closet. And I have no clue where on this reel you'll find Jan and Neil.
One of our producers took the film to a processing company to get it transferred to a format that would allow us and Corinne to view it. When we picked it up, never before seen footage of a serious space explorer enjoying himself on a sunny day in Space City. Corinne's reaction? Well, the word glee comes to mind.
Who's riding? Neil.
Just a pool party with Neil Armstrong. No big deal.
That's me. That's Neil.
Corinne pointed out her sorority sister.
That's Jan.
And the Armstrong children.
And that's little Mark. He's gonna do his thing.
Armstrong, 1 year before he pulled off one of the most difficult landings in history, getting a tutorial on how to drive a motorized scooter from the kids.
He's learning from them how to work it.
A joy-filled flashback 50 years to the past, bringing up even more memories, like the time Jan wouldn't eat carbs.
Just before he was to fly to the moon, they came over for dinner, and Jan was on a diet because she knew she was going to be in front of the news. She said, "Oh, I can't eat bread." So she just had a plain hamburger, and without the bread. But Neil ate plenty. And I remember one time we were there at their house in the backyard playing in the pool, and he said something about, I don't know how it came up. Jerry asked him what he did that day or something. He said, "Oh, well," he said, "I took the lunar up, but it crashed." We said, "What?" He said, "Yeah, I crashed it." And he was just as calm about it. That was the day that he took that lunar lander up for the first time, and it malfunctioned or something, and he parachuted out of the thing. And he was just like, "Yeah, it crashed." I was like, oh my God.
And how did she react when Armstrong made history?
It's like, wow, my neighbor's on the moon. I teased him later. We were at their house for a barbecue, and the moon came out, and it was a watermelon, with the shape this way. And I said, "Neil, you're the moon man. How come I've never noticed the moon with the crescent on the bottom like that? It's usually to the side." He said, "I don't know."
An estimated 650 million viewers watched the first steps on the moon live, and KPRC played a major role in that. Our station started the pipeline that sent the video and sound into homes across the world.
It's a connection that we are proud to have, and we are equally proud of the Channel 2 employees who made it happen. Our Phil Archer spoke with members of the team that made space and television history.
It was the high-water mark of the American century. A triumph of American technology and spirit, the culmination of a crusade that began in Houston 7 years earlier.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
When Neil Armstrong fulfilled that promise, his one small step was broadcast live around the world on television.
Beautiful view.
Those dark, grainy images sent back to Earth were almost as much of a miracle as the landing itself.
I think I'll do the same.
NASA spent a decade developing the technology to do it. The television signal relayed from the spacecraft's 2 onboard cameras to ground stations in Australia and California, and from there relayed to Houston's Manned Spacecraft Center, where about 60 KPRC technicians working for NASA helped broadcast it to the world. The station's planning was meticulous, right down to crew sheets and camera positions. Preparation for something never seen before in human history.
You had to feel it. You had to feel it. You had to know this was something special.
Bruce Bryant was a technical director. David Lavelle and Ron Putterman were both working as camera operators. All were in their 20s, all aware they were making history by putting on the most important broadcast of the 20th century.
The whole world was looking through my camera. Suddenly realized what you were involved in.
Mainly, we felt, or I felt, excitement, more than pressure, and just anticipation, just the feeling that, hey, this is it.
At the time, the world and the nation were in turmoil. The U.S. was fighting a hot war in Vietnam and a cold one in Europe. The Stonewall riots erupted in New York that June, and within a few weeks, Chappaquiddick and the Manson family would become household names. But at the Manned Spacecraft Center that summer afternoon, television brought the world together. Bruce Bryant punched the button that sent video of men on the moon around the world.
One of them said, well, Bruce, in a minute you're going to get a picture from the moon, and when you see it, just punch it up. And I thought, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. And pretty soon, that's just what happened.
Contact light. Okay, engine stop.
The mission control in the landing or even approaching the moon, there was total silence. And everybody just holding their breath because they heard what's going to happen. And when the final landing and the LEM landed on the moon, it was just like, okay, we can breathe, now what?
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
We were certainly holding our breath, and people around the world were holding their breath, and I always felt like that helped cushion that landing. Somehow, some way, they landed on our breath.
They were doing a job, working around the clock, but still watching with awe, along with their audience, as Neil Armstrong fulfilled the dream of 6 million millennia with those now familiar words.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
And you just felt such great relief and joy and pride and all of that stuff, and everybody felt it all at once.
The pictures they brought to the world tell the story, but not all of it. To feel the magic of that moment, you had to be there.
You did feel a connection with everyone around the world, and I don't think that since that moment, that afternoon in Houston, the world has ever come together again like they did, because everyone wanted them to be successful. Everyone was pulling for them.
Still ahead, Houston after splashdown and the Apollo program.
Things got kind of quiet. That was the first time I think I understood or heard the word layoff.
Our space community grounded, what it took to lift it back up.
Booster ignition and liftoff of Endeavour.
On clicktohouston.com right now, the moon landing brought a lot of firsts, including a cosmic coup for this local man.
You're the first man in the world to touch the moon dust with his bare hands.
How one misstep on the moon by Neil Armstrong gave Terry Slezak this claim to fame on clicktohouston.com/Apollo.
One of the most influential space pioneers never even wore a spacesuit. Christopher Kraft kept his feet firmly on the ground and played an integral role in all things spaceflight. From the Mercury and Gemini missions that first sent Americans into space, to the Apollo missions that landed them on the moon, Kraft was a visionary, the nucleus of NASA. The agency's first mission control flight director, he led the design and implementation of the Manned Spacecraft Center, now Johnson Space Center. He later became director of JSC. At age 95, he still lives in Clear Lake, proud of his role in space history.
I was privileged to be in that position. Very privileged. I mean, who the hell was going to be flight director on the first space flight of first 7, actually more than that, 15 or so flights. I'm proud to carry the torch.
We have now moved to a different area of the Christopher Kraft Mission Control Center. This one is staffed 24 hours a day. Those workers are in charge of all actions of the International Space Station.
It's just one example of how the work here at Johnson Space Center never stopped. Our Keith Garvin now with what Houston was like after splashdown.
July 24th, 1969, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins returned to Earth with the splash heard round the world. America's heroes were back. And while NASA continued with a regimented post-lunar landing protocol, the Apollo 11 astronauts got a taste of their stardom, which included some high-profile visits while they were in quarantine.
Neil, Buzz, and Mike, I want you to know that I think I'm the luckiest man in the world. And I say this not only because I have the honor to be President of the United States, but particularly because I have the privilege of speaking for so many and welcoming you back.
The world was over the moon, hungry for details about the first lunar landing. But while they were basking in the post-flight fame,
all engines running, commit, liftoff.
The space agency, Houstonians, got right back to business.
We landed on the moon on Apollo 11, but the program didn't end there. We were to land again 5 more times.
This is really a rock and roll ride, isn't it?
10 more men would feel the lunar surface under their feet, but in 1972, the program was canceled. Apollo 17 would be its last. A devastating blow to many Houston families, including astronaut Gerald Kars. He was slated to be the lunar module pilot for Apollo 19.
I think there was a lot of disbelief because there was so much more we could do. And there was so much more that we'd planned to do.
It was really hard after the Apollo program ended. Things got kind of quiet. That was the first time I think I understood or heard the word layoff.
But manned space flights would continue with Skylab, NASA's first space station, basically a science lab in space.
Skylab was really focused on trying to understand the long-term effects of zero gravity on the human body. So it was a program that had a number of life science experiments.
Alan went on to fly on Skylab in 1973. He often said to me, you know, Skylab was harder than going to the moon because every day we had an experiment. On his particular flight, it was the study of man's body, how it reacted to space.
Skylab would be Kars' chance to go to space and make his family proud.
Well, I was 15 years old when my dad flew on Skylab 4, and I was old enough to really understand what was going on. And I was in high school at the time, and just, you know, really am grateful that I was of an age when he flew that I could really understand and appreciate, follow along, and be part of it.
That would be the final manned trip to Skylab.
We've gone for main engine start. We have.
Next came the Shuttle, a majestic era of spaceflight that would last 30 years.
I can remember sitting on my living room floor in Austin, Texas as a senior at UT, watching the space shuttle, STS-1, landing on a runway. And it was the most amazing thing I'd ever seen. I was like, wow, things have really changed.
The space shuttle was a great vehicle, a very flexible vehicle, and it gave us the capability to do construction in Earth orbit. And with the space shuttle, we were actually able to build the International Space Station.
The shuttle program would get people excited about space again, but it introduced a new generation to the heartbreak a space disaster could bring.
This is Mission Control Houston. We have no additional word at this time.
Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country.
That was the first time that I had any fear, because all of a sudden I put myself in the kids of those guys that flew, because I would have been the same age as they had. That if something had happened to Dad on that flight, and I thought, what a horrible feeling. And that was actually the first time ever that I had ever any fear that something might happen and he might not come back.
It would be more than 2 years before another shuttle mission, but when it was back, it was back.
5, 4,
flying dozens of missions from the late 80s to the early 2000s. Until another space catastrophe, Columbia.
Just 16 minutes before landing in Florida, the spaceship broke up in the skies over Texas. It sent charred shuttle pieces raining down over Nacogdoches and other parts of East Texas.
But the shuttle program would continue into the next decade until July of 2011.
And liftoff, the final liftoff of Atlantis.
A nighttime landing closing this chapter.
Having fired the imagination of a generation, a ship like no other, its place in history secured, the space shuttle pulls into port for the last time.
With the termination of the shuttle program came the end of manned spaceflight launches from American soil. Astronauts now leave Earth with cosmonauts aboard the Soyuz launched from Kazakhstan. But future U.S. launches are in reach, so stay tuned.
Still ahead, the future of space exploration,
The purpose of the space program is to find another place to live.
where the space pioneers of the past think we should go next.
On clicktohouston.com right now, a member of the next generation of spaceflight, launching into space on the 50th anniversary of the moon landing.
Especially exciting because we have the honor of commemorating this great historical event.
And when Drew Morgan blasts off on Saturday, he'll have a cheering section in Friendswood.
It's kind of off the charts exciting that, we're all going to kind of just gather in the street in a few days and we're going to watch like a buddy, a close friend of ours, shoot into space.
That story and more on clicktohouston.com/Apollo.
We've moved again. NASA now allowing us on the floor of what's called the White Flight Control Room. This will serve as mission control for future space flights.
America's return to the moon and then Mars will be orchestrated from this very room. Our Christine Noel has a look ahead to the future of spaceflight.
I am inside Building 9 in the Space Vehicle Mock-Up Facility, and this is a mock-up of the Orion space capsule. It is built to take humans farther than they've ever been before.
3, 2, 1, ignition.
NASA is getting back in the manned spaceflight game. A return to the moon on the Orion will fall under the Artemis program. A fitting name. In Greek mythology, Artemis was the twin sister of Apollo. A lot has to happen first, but NASA's goal is to send Americans back to the moon by 2024.
I wish Daddy was here to see that. He never wanted to be known as the last man on the moon.
I really hope Artemis is successful and we land on the moon.
We have to go back to the moon. I think it's really important that this generation, my generation, and the generation after understand what's required. There's so many things we still need to learn. There's so many things that we can do on the moon.
The next generation of spaceflight is game for it. Astronaut Jessica Meir heads to the ISS in September, but the moon is on her bucket list.
I find it hard to believe that there's anyone in our office right now that would turn down a trip to the moon. I know for me that would really be the ultimate.
Many of the space pioneers we talk to say when we return to the moon, this time we should stay a while.
I think the first thing we need to do is figure out how to live on the moon, and then we'll know how to live on another planet somewhere else. So I think you learn a lot like that. Just like we learned how to get into space with Mercury, then Gemini, and then Apollo. Well, we need to learn how to live somewhere else and then figure out how to get to Mars.
The purpose of the space program is to find another place to live. Someday we can't live here. The sun's going to burn up someday. So we're going to have to go somewhere else.
The moon may be next, but NASA also has its sights on deep space. And so does Apollo 11 astronaut Michael Collins.
Where do you think we ought to go next? Mars. Mars, no question. I like that. Yes. Can you get it? Put on a T-shirt or something? I like that, yes.
And it's not just countries running this 21st century space race. Companies are too. SpaceX and Boeing both playing a big role in NASA's short-term space goals, including sending astronauts to the International Space Station with U.S. launches, wait for it, within a year.
We would now start flying eventually, very soon, out of Florida. We're going to have vehicles that are going to be built, what we call the Commercial Crew Program. They've been competing to build those vehicles.
I hope NASA continues to lead the way and brings along all the international partners and the companies that need to help them be successful.
Meanwhile, Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic are running a race of their own. And the winner could be you. They're working to give space tourists the suborbital trip of a lifetime. Both companies hoping to begin their commercial expeditions within a year's time.
It's an exciting time, and I didn't know if I would see it in my career time. We're getting close. How cool is that?
Wherever we go next, back to the moon, Mars, or even beyond, it was the space pioneers of the past who laid the groundwork, the trailblazers of Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo.
And that is why this anniversary, 50 years since the moon landing, is so important to celebrate. We are Space City, and we are all part of this incredible moment in space history.
Thank you for joining us for this tribute to Houston's mission to the moon. Good night.
We've celebrated this every year since the time we first landed on the moon, but it doesn't seem that it's the 50th year.
Pride. At the moment that they put the touchdown, got off, got out, and put the flag up, all those were moments of pride.
The final descent to the lunar surface was, for me, the highlight of flight.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
I think there are very few people who really understand how dangerous it was. And Neil had to do it manually. Absolutely amazing. He was the right guy.
Strange reaction, like I've never seen that thing before in my life. And then I suddenly realized, oh, wait a minute, I once was up there.
Looked up and saw that crescent moon hanging in the sky. It was like, this is not a simulation. We're really there.
The voyage of Apollo still seemed incredible.
It is something special. I mean, there's only been 12 people that's been there.